It was the sort of autumnal morning that gave every indication of imminent rain without ever fulfilling the promise. One of those grey, indecisive English days that dawdle about the weather like an underbutler asked to take a firm position on the sherry. Lord Peter Wimsey, on his way to inspect an illuminated manuscript of dubious authenticity at Copplesby Hall, found himself diverted, both geographically and philosophically, by the unmistakable sound of village gossip carried on the brittle air. "Horrid business," said a stout woman in mauve rubber galoshes, addressing no one in particular, but clearly hoping to be overheard, down at the vicarage. "They say it were all proper last night, and this morning dead as Queen Anne." Wimsey, pausing to admire a frost-bitten hollyhock, tilted his head like a fox terrier presented with an unfamiliar biscuit. He turned to Bunter, who bore the road atlas with the solemnity of a high church liturgical text. "My dear Bunter," said Wimsey, "what is it the good book says? In the midst of Copplesby there is death, or am I confusing it with Ecclesiastes?" "Possibly an extrapolation of Revelation, my lord," said Bunter, not looking up. "Splendid. Then let us have a detour. I do so hate being out of date on local fatalities." It transpired upon arrival at the vicarage, a square, sober house with pensive ivy and a demeanour of mild disappointment, that the Reverend Ainsworth's guest had indeed passed into the hereafter with very little warning and even less inconvenience. In fact, the most inconvenient aspect, to hear the vicar tell it, was the sheer tidiness of the scene. "I assure you, Lord Peter, nothing was out of place," said the Reverend, wringing his hands like a man contemplating the doctrine of original sin and not liking where it was leading. The bed was smooth, the books were in alphabetical order. He was simply lying there as if asleep, save for the rather telling absence of respiration. "Ah," said Wimsey, removing his gloves with languid precision, "an inconsiderate guest who made no mess. One begins to suspect foul play at once. The deceased was introduced posthumously as one Mr. Felix Cornwood, an antiquarian of minor reputation, a bachelor of firm punctuality, and a guest of the vicar for the past 3 days, during which he had eaten without complaint and discussed Milton with alarming enthusiasm." Wimsey inspected the guest room with Bunter in silent tow. It was, as advertised, aggressively neat. The bed was made, the wash basin dry, and the guest's valise perfectly squared against the corner. Only the man himself, prone across the coverlet, pale and strangely tranquil, spoiled the general effect of order. "Very neat," murmured Wimsey, leaning over the body with a gaze as impersonal as a well-polished lorgnette. "Very composed. Too composed, perhaps." "He was like this when we found him," said the Reverend. "The doctor says it was his heart." "But he was only 55. 55, said Wimsey, lightly tugging the stiff cuff of the dead man's shirt. "Unfashionably early for natural causes, especially in such hygienic surroundings." He turned abruptly to the desk, immaculate save for a blotter, a slim volume of Horace, and a fountain pen aligned as though awaiting judgment. A faint scent lingered in the air, lavender perhaps, or something older, dustier. Wimsey sniffed. "Bunter, I detect the unmistakable odour of deliberate arrangements." "Indeed, my lord," said Bunter. "The shoes under the bed have been polished, but there is no cloth visible. Also, the inkwell is full, yet the nib of the pen is dry. An inconsistency, if I may say so." "You may." "And I do admire a corpse who tidies up after himself before expiring, but I distrust the impulse. Morbidly house-proud men are rarely prone to sudden death." The local constable, a man of admirable moustache and limited imagination, was quick to declare it all a sad coincidence. "Natural, that's what the doctor said. Heart just gave out." "Did it?" said Wimsey, more to himself than anyone else. He examined the man's hands. The left thumb bore the faintest smear of ink, yet the paper on the blotter was untouched. "And yet," he said cheerfully, Mr. Cornwood left no final note, no complaint, no mislaid sock. Quite unlike the recently deceased. Bit of a fuss for a natural death, if I may, grumbled the constable. My dear fellow, said Wimsey, smiling faintly, nature is rarely so obliging. Death is an untidy business. When it presents itself with surgical cleanliness and a polite bow, it's time to ask who swept up the mess. He turned to the vicar. May I remain for luncheon, Reverend? I find myself suddenly intrigued. It is not every day one meets a corpse who made his bed before dying in it. And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped across the threshold of the guest-room, humming a line of Dawn, and wondering, not for the first time, whether the neatest arrangements concealed the nastiest intentions. The Reverend Ainsworth's cook, Mrs. Pritchard, was summoned with the apologetic reluctance of a man more accustomed to sermonizing on the Beatitudes than interrogating his domestic staff. She arrived with hands still damp from dishwater and an expression of long-suffering submission to the whims of gentlemen and the ill-timed demise of guests. Lord Peter Wimsey, who had settled into an armchair of indeterminate pattern and considerable discomfort, greeted her with a smile that suggested both deference and the possibility of mild mischief. Good morning, Mrs. Pritchard. I understand you prepared the unfortunate Mr. Cornwood's meals? She nodded, arms folded protectively across her middle. Breakfast, dinner, and supper, my lord, though he weren't much for supper. Said a bit of cheese and an apple was plenty. A man of monkish restraint. Did he mention any illness, indigestion, heartburn, ague, or metaphysical dissatisfaction? Not to me, sir. Ate, what he was given, and thanked me for it properly. Very tidy in his habits, if I may say so, folded his napkin square, even left his apple cores on the side plate. Indeed, Bunter, take note. That will be the apple core, symbol of lost innocence or merely good manners. We shall see. Mrs. Pritchard, when did you last see Mr. Cornwood alive? Last night, sir, after supper. He went to his room at 10:15. I saw him on the stairs with a candle. Said good night, and he said it back. No callers, visitors, or peculiar noises in the night? She pursed her lips. Peculiar enough house at times, sir. Old pipes, creaky boards. Nothing out of the ordinary, though, unless you count Mr. Tevisham. Ah, said Wimsey, seizing the name with feline interest. And who, pray, is Mr. Tevisham? The organist, sir? Lives at the edge of the village. He came by late, 10:15 or so. Wanted to speak to the vicar. Bit flushed, if you know what I mean. Said he'd had a sudden idea about the harvest anthem. Stayed no more than 10 minutes. Did he mention seeing Mr. Cornwood? Not a word, sir. Wimsey leaned back, steepling his fingers. A musical visitation at 10:15. Very noble. Nothing else disturbed the household? Only the cat, sir. Meowing at the back door. Round midnight. Wants to get in, wants to get out again. Silly creature. A most trustworthy witness, the domestic cat. Pity it never testifies. Wimsey rose and glanced once more at the tidy room where Cornwood had expired so tastefully. I think we should now look more closely at the deceased's personal effects. The suitcase proved a disappointment. It contained 2 shirts, a pair of neatly folded flannel trousers, a second pair of shoes, a toothbrush in a silver tube, and a small, leather-bound journal. Entirely blank. No diary entries, murmured Wimsey. Either a very dull man or a very cautious one. Bunter, what do you make of the shoes? Bunter bent to inspect them. Both pairs recently polished, my lord. However, one pair, those in the case, are scuffed on the outer right sole. The other, beside the bed, is clean underneath. Suggesting he wore the scuffed pair out of doors yesterday but changed into the clean ones before retiring. Impeccably neat to the end. Yet that raises the question, if he changed his shoes, where are the trousers he wore out? Not in the drawer, my lord. nor in the wardrobe. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. A man who folds his napkin wouldn't toss his trousers into the hedge. Interesting. A cursory inspection of the wardrobe revealed a single suit hanging, brushed and pressed. But behind it, folded and tucked with almost desperate precision, was a second pair of trousers, creased at the knees, slightly damp at the hem, and dusted faintly with what looked like chalk or flour. "That," said Whimsy softly, "is a pair of trousers trying not to be noticed. Fetching, isn't it?" "Curious that they should be concealed at all," Bunter observed. "Very. Now then, who else has a key to this room?" The Reverend, summoned again and looking faintly harassed by the burden of death amidst sermon prep, confirmed that only he and the late Mr. Cornwood had access. "Unless the window was used," he added, "though that seems unlikely. It's a narrow drop to the gravel, and we've had no sign of forced entry." Whimsy walked to the window and tested the latch. It swung open with a slight creak. The garden beyond was orderly, gravel raked into symmetrical paths, the flower beds recently turned. Below the guest room, a rose bush pressed against the wall like an eavesdropper. "Bunter, do you see what I see?" "The rose bush, my lord." Broken stem. And the gravel beneath it, disrupted. Someone stepped here recently, I think. Either Mr. Cornwood climbed in after hours, or someone else came in, or out, without wishing to be observed. It would explain the trousers, my lord. And much else, I dare say. Still, it's all rather unconvincing. A man dies in a neat room with his valise packed and his shoes polished. But he goes out in the night, gets his trousers muddied, hides them, and then expires like a monk after Vespers. Something here's out of key. They moved next to the vicar's modest study. The room bore the unmistakable scent of pipe tobacco, old sermons, and mild ecclesiastical disappointment. A bookshelf sagged under the weight of unconsulted theology. Whimsy drifted toward the escritoire and picked up a bookmark lying beside a volume of Eusebius. "Is this yours, Reverend?" "No, I don't believe so. Why?" "It's a railway timetable, folded quite precisely and creased in a manner suggesting recent use. From last month, curiously. One wonders why a visitor would carry an expired schedule unless he had something to hide." "You think Felix, Mr. Cornwood, might have been intending to leave early, or had arrived from somewhere he wished us not to notice? An out-of-date timetable might be a convenience to someone feigning a particular journey." They returned to the guest room just as the doctor reappeared with a sheaf of forms and a weary sigh. "I've signed the certificate," he said. "Nothing obvious. No signs of poison or struggle. Heart failure remains most likely." "Of course," said Whimsy affably. The tidy man, struck down by his own scrupulous cardiac muscle. "Still, may I trouble you for a note on the time of death?" "Approximately midnight. Give or take an hour." Whimsy smiled as if that clinched something. "And where were you, Reverend, at that time?" "In bed, Lord Peter." "Reading Isaiah." "A worthy alibi." He paused, then moved to the desk and plucked the pen from its precise placement. "Bunter, how long does it take a fountain pen to dry when uncapped?" "Depending on ink and humidity. Half an hour, my lord." "Perhaps less." "And yet Mr. Cornwood's is dry as the book of Leviticus. A man dies at midnight in bed with a capped pen, having left no note and no complaint, except, perhaps—" He turned back to the Reverend for a misplaced pair of trousers and a rather pointed visit to the garden. The Reverend looked nonplussed. "Do you believe he was murdered?" Whimsy, with the faintest shrug, replied, "I believe someone very much wished his death to appear natural. And they went to quite elaborate lengths to make it so. That sort of devotion, Reverend, rarely springs from indifference." He turned again to the window, gazing out at the raked gravel and broken rosebush below. "And I believe," he added softly, "that the neatness is not evidence of Mr. Cornwood's habits, but of someone else's guilt." As Bunter closed the window and drew the curtains against the greying light, Lord Peter Wimsey stood quite still in the centre of the room, head tilted, as though listening to something unsaid. Then he smiled. "Let us speak to this Mr. Teversham, shall we? Music may soothe the savage breast, but it is no alibi for murder." The village of Copplesby, with its mellow brick cottages and neatly clipped hedges, was a place where scandal moved with the discreet pace of a hedgehog at dusk, slow, deliberate, and thoroughly vetted by the vicar's wife before the curate had even heard a whisper. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, had long understood that beneath such genteel exteriors lurked a labyrinth of unspoken motives and tangled resentments, the kind that made murder an unwelcome yet not entirely surprising guest at the vicarage. Mr. Teversham's home was a modest but characterful cottage on the village outskirts, distinguished primarily by a profusion of wind chimes and a carefully tended bed of forget-me-nots. The organist himself was a thin, angular man with eyes like quicksilver and hands that trembled ever so slightly as he shook Wimsey's. "Lord Peter, an unexpected honour," said Teversham, ushering them inside with the sort of nervous energy reserved for men who felt life had dealt them a rather clumsy hand. Bunter, ever the discreet shadow, lingered at the doorway, leaving Wimsey alone with the jittery musician amid a clutter of sheet music and a battered harmonium. "I gather you called on Reverend Ainsworth rather late last night," Wimsey began, folding his hands behind his back. "May I ask the purpose of your visit?" Teversham swallowed. "I had an idea about the harvest anthem, yes. Something about a different rhythm that might better suit the congregation. I was eager to share it. You understand, in my profession, timing is everything quite," said Wimsey, who had learnt long ago that every man's timing concealed a personal urgency. "And you arrived at the vicarage at 10:15. "That's correct. I stayed 10 minutes or so. We discussed the anthem. I left promptly. And Mr. Cornwood, did you see him?" No. I didn't see him after dinner. I assumed he had gone to bed." Wimsey's gaze sharpened. "At 10:15, Mr. Teversham, did you notice anything unusual? Sounds? Movements?" Teversham shook his head. Only the usual creaking of the floorboards. The wind through the eaves. The cat yowling for admittance, I suppose. "The cat," Wimsey repeated thoughtfully. "Did it stay outside long?" "Perhaps a quarter of an hour. Then it must have found a way in or lost interest." "I see." Wimsey's attention drifted to a music stand, where a manuscript lay half obscured by a scattering of loose notes. He picked it up and turned it over. The handwriting was precise, but the margins bore annotations in a different hand, smaller, more hurried. "Whose handwriting is this?" Wimsey asked. Teversham peered over his shoulder. "Mine. Though the annotations, I don't recognize them." "How intriguing," murmured Wimsey, replacing the sheet with care. "And your evening after leaving the vicarage? Where did you go?" "To my sister's in East Copplesby. We discussed a recital next month. I arrived there by 11:15 and stayed until nearly 1. Can anyone corroborate your presence?" "My sister's maid and her husband. Both reliable." Wimsey nodded, storing the detail. "And you returned home by foot?" "Yes. A short walk under the streetlights. Thank you, Mr. Teversham. I trust you will understand if I need to verify these accounts. The matter is delicate." Teversham's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Of course, Lord Peter." Anything to assist back in the vicarage, Wimsey and Bunter discussed the organist's testimony. "It's all terribly proper," Bunter observed. "Nothing untoward, and yet something feels amiss." Wimsey's eyes gleamed. "Yes, the devil is in the details. For instance, the timeline. Teversham leaves at roughly 10:15. The cat meows for admission around midnight. Cornwood supposedly dies at midnight. But if Teversham returned home by foot around 1, he would have had to leave the vicarage very promptly. And yet no one heard him come or go." "Precisely." The vicar's house is old, but not so soundproof as to muffle a man's footsteps on the gravel path. Unless the gravel was already disturbed, Bunter mused. Exactly. And then there is the matter of the trousers. Damp, dusty, and hidden. Why conceal them if the owner died peacefully in bed? Something forced a nocturnal excursion. But what? The knock at the door interrupted their speculations. It was Constable Green, looking more uncertain than usual. "Sir, we've found something at the vicarage garden." Near the rose bush, Whimsy followed the constable outside. There, amid the gravel, lay a small, crumpled piece of paper, damp and faintly fragrant with lavender. Bunter picked it up carefully. "A torn page from a book," he said, "printed in Latin." From Cicero's De Officiis, Whimsy read aloud, "Neque enim ignaviae poenam sequamur, sedut alios efficiamus in rem publicam utiles." For we do not incur punishment for laziness, but to make others useful to the Republic. An odd quotation to find discarded in a murder scene, Whimsy remarked, especially in a vicarage garden. "Is there any significance, my lord?" asked the constable. Whimsy fingered his chin. "It is an exhortation to duty and public service. Yes. Yet it may be a hint or a threat, intended for someone with a classical education." He turned to Bunter. "Find out if this page matches any books in the vicarage library, and see if any volumes are missing pages." "Yes, my lord." Inside, the library was a sanctuary of ordered knowledge, with leather-bound tomes arrayed on shelves that reached the ceiling. Whimsy surveyed the titles with a connoisseur's eye. "Anything missing from the De Officiis?" he asked the vicar. The Reverend shook his head, bewildered. "I'm not sure. I seldom open that volume. It's more for show." Bunter, however, emerged from a tall bookcase after several minutes, holding a copy with a ragged page. "Page 143, my lord. Torn clean from Cicero. The passage on duty and public service." Whimsy smiled thinly. "That settles the origin of our garden fragment. Now we must ask, who tore this page, and why discard it in the rose bush?" Reverend Ainsworth, fidgeting by the window, suggested, perhaps someone wished to warn Mr. Cornwood, or to intimidate him. A distinct possibility, but threats require recipients, and recipients sometimes respond. Whimsy paced slowly, thinking aloud. "We have a man who dies unexpectedly in an immaculate room. Yet evidence suggests he ventured out late at night, hiding trousers, disturbed gravel, a torn classical warning. And we have Mr. Teversham, who appeared flushed and left abruptly after a brief visit. I suspect these threads are intertwined." The vicar looked perplexed. "I fear this may go beyond anything I expected." "Indeed," said Whimsy. "May I inquire, what was Mr. Cornwood's business in Copplesby?" "Antiquarian research, mostly. He was interested in local manuscripts and church archives. Said he hoped to uncover something about the medieval clergy here. And did he share these ambitions with anyone else?" "Only me, and perhaps his friend, a Miss Eleanor Marsh." "Miss Marsh? She's a scholar from Oxford." "Visiting the village this week, working on a related project." "Ah, a fresh link in the chain," said Whimsy. "Might we meet her?" Reverend Ainsworth nodded. "She's at the vicarage now, helping with the archives." "I can fetch her." Within the hour, Miss Marsh arrived, a woman of sharp features and keen eyes, with the manner of one used to debating at high tables rather than the vicarage parlor. She greeted Whimsy with a nod that was both cautious and curious. "I understand you're investigating Mr. Cornwood's death," she said, "and that you have questions." Whimsy inclined his head indeed. "I gather you and the deceased shared scholarly interests?" "Very much so. We were collaborating on the transcription of some medieval letters found in the diocesan archives. Were there disagreements between you? Scholarly or otherwise?" She hesitated. "There was one matter we disputed, the authenticity of a particular letter attributed to a 12th century bishop. Felix was convinced it was genuine. I thought it a forgery. And this disagreement, did it escalate beyond academic debate? Not in words, no, but Felix was passionate, sometimes inflexible. Did he receive any threats, Miss Marsh? From anyone connected to his research? She shook her head. Not explicitly, but the region has its guardians, local historians and clergy who dislike outsiders poking into old secrets. Indeed, secrets often breed resentment. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. Miss Marsh, may I ask, did Mr. Cornwood leave any notes or clues relating to this disputed letter? None that I've seen, but he was secretive lately, often working late into the night. Did he ever mention a visitor or unexpected disturbance? Only that he felt watched and once found a window ajar despite locking his room. Whimsy's expression was unreadable. Curious. As Miss Marsh excused herself to tend to the archives, Whimsy turned to Bunter. We are gathering pieces of a puzzle. A man who feels threatened, a torn Latin page, a hidden pair of trousers, and a disturbed window. I suspect we are nearing the heart of this mystery. Bunter nodded. And the organist's mysterious visit. Precisely. It is time we examine the vicarage itself more thoroughly, particularly that guest room and its curious cleanliness. The afternoon waned, and the autumn light dipped behind cloud, casting long shadows across the vicarage. Whimsy, standing by the window that looked out onto the rosebush and gravel path, allowed himself a small, private smile. Sometimes, Bunter, the neatest crime leaves the most untidy traces. And so the threads of deceit, fear, and scholarly rivalry began to weave into a tapestry more sinister than anyone had anticipated, yet still entirely of this world, and entirely solvable by a mind that took pleasure in the subtle and the obscure. Tomorrow, Whimsy promised himself, the vicarage would yield its secrets at last. The next morning dawned grey and damp, as if Copplesby itself were holding its breath in anticipation. The vicarage seemed particularly still under the overcast sky, the creeping chill settling like an invisible veil over its tidy lawns and shadowed eaves. Lord Peter Whimsy, his moustache impeccably waxed but his expression notably serious, had insisted on an early start. There were details to attend to, and a curiosity that had begun to thrum with the increasing clarity of a finely tuned clock. Bunter was already in the kitchen when Whimsy joined him for breakfast. The butler had that slightly ruffled look of a man who had been up well before dawn, his grey eyes bright beneath the brim of his cap. I took the liberty of speaking again with Mrs. Digby, Bunter said quietly, referring to the housekeeper. She recalls a peculiar habit of the late Mr. Cornwood's, a nightly check of the guest-room door. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. A nightly check? To what end? Apparently, he insisted the door be locked each evening before retiring, yet the lock was somewhat fickle. On several occasions, Mrs. Digby said she heard him fumbling with it well past 9 o'clock. Curious. And yet the guest-room was, as we noted, immaculate. Too immaculate for a room used regularly. A paradox, one might say. Indeed, my lord. Mrs. Digby also mentioned that no one had been invited to use that room for several weeks. Which aligns oddly with Miss Marsh's account of the window left ajar, does it not? Bunter nodded. Yes, the window was in the guest room. Then I think we shall pay a visit to the room itself, Whimsy decided. The guest room was at the far end of the long corridor on the first floor, its white paint gleaming faintly in the morning light filtering through the lace curtains. As Whimsy entered, the first thing that struck him was the almost oppressive neatness. Everything in its place, the bed impeccably made, the carpet freshly vacuumed. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. Whimsy's gaze was drawn immediately to the window, which stood ajar just wide enough to admit a slender finger. The latch appeared intact, but showed signs of recent manipulation. Tiny scratches marred the brass. An entrance or exit, no doubt, Whimsy murmured, crouching to examine the window sill. Bunter, notice the dust here? Disturbed, as if something or someone brushed against it recently. Bunter knelt beside him. The gravel outside also shows signs of disruption, he observed, consistent with a climb down or a hurried departure. And the trousers found hidden beneath the floorboards, Whimsy added thoughtfully. Something compelled the wearer to remove them in haste and conceal them. He stood and moved to inspect the lock on the door. It was an old-fashioned Yale, somewhat worn, and clearly not entirely trustworthy. Mr. Cornwood was cautious, perhaps paranoid, Whimsy said. But more than that, this door and window tell a story of concealment and fear. The vicarage itself seemed to close in around them as Whimsy's mind pieced together the evening's likely movements. He glanced at the bedside table, where a small notebook lay, its cover worn but the pages pristine. Opening it, Whimsy found neat entries detailing Cornwood's research progress, notes on local parish records, and a single page scribbled hastily with a series of names and dates, many crossed out, others underlined in red ink. Bunter, do you recognize any of these names? Bunter squinted. Most are from Copplesby's history, archdeacons, wardens. But this one, he pointed to a name near the bottom, William Hargrave. He was the village blacksmith 50 years ago. Known for his fiery temper, a name worth investigating. Whimsy agreed. Later that morning, they called on the village's unofficial historian, a Mr. Ellis, who ran a small curiosity shop in the center of Copplesby. His shop was a repository of oddities, weathered tomes, faded photographs, and odd trinkets that seemed to whisper stories of bygone days. Ellis was a portly man with a ruddy complexion and a careful manner. When presented with the name William Hargrave, he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Ah, yes, Hargrave. A difficult man, some said. More than one quarrel ended in broken fences or worse. He vanished one night, they say, left without a word, and no one ever saw him again. Whimsy's eyes twinkled with interest. Vanished, you say? Any idea where he went? Ellis shrugged. No one knew. Some whispered he'd fled after a particularly nasty incident. Maybe a fight with a rival or the law catching up. Others thought he might have been spirited away by the supernatural. You know how these villagers like to spin their tales. Whimsy smiled thinly. Indeed, but I suspect our mystery, much like that vanished Smith, will be explained by human hands. With the villagers past whispering secrets, Whimsy returned to the vicarage to compare notes with Bunter. We have a man who disappeared decades ago, a name appearing in the victim's notes, and a guest room that suggests fear of intrusion. Add to that the torn Latin page. An admonition to duty, and we may begin to glimpse a motive. Bunter looked thoughtful. Might Mr. Cornwood have uncovered something in his research that threatened someone's interests? Very likely. And someone desperate enough to kill rather than lose it. Whimsy poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the fire, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The chronology remains vital. Tevisham's late visit, the timing of the death, the window left open, the hidden trousers. Each a thread in the fabric of this night's tale. Have we verified the organist's alibi? Bunter inquired. His sister's servants confirm his presence, but we must remain vigilant. Alibis are often built on the foundation of presumption. The afternoon shadows deepened, and Whimsy requested a visit to the vicarage kitchen where Mrs. Digby awaited. Mrs. Digby, Whimsy began gently, you mentioned Mr. Cornwood checked the guest room door nightly. Did you notice any visitors or disturbances in recent weeks? The housekeeper folded her hands tightly. No visitors to that room, sir. But I did hear muffled voices one evening, low and hurried, near the back of the house. It was after Mr. Tevisham's visit. I believe, did you recognize the voices? No, sir. Too faint and quick. But there was tension, sharp words. I thought better not to listen. Whimsy nodded appreciatively. You have done well to tell me. The timing is crucial. Later, Bunter returned with a small discovery, a leather-bound diary found tucked behind a loose panel in the guest room's wardrobe. The leather was cracked and worn, but the pages inside were filled with meticulous handwriting. Whimsy settled into an armchair as Bunter read aloud from the first entry. October 1st. The burden grows heavier. Each day I fear that the past, long buried, stirs again to claim its due. I dare not trust the village anymore. Shadows lengthen in the quietest corners. A chill crept over the room. This was written by Mr. Cornwood himself, Bunter confirmed. Indeed, and it speaks of fear and suspicion, not merely scholarly concern. The past he chased is not a harmless curiosity. It is a weapon. As the diary's entries progressed, a pattern emerged of secret meetings, veiled threats, and a desperate attempt to reveal a long-concealed scandal tied to the mysterious William Hargrave. The last entry was dated only days before the murder. Whimsy folded the diary closed. We are drawing ever nearer to the heart of this mystery, Bunter. There is a theater of shadows here, a village playing a dangerous game with its own history. Bunter leaned forward, lowering his voice. And I suspect the organist is no mere bystander. Whimsy smiled faintly, a glint of irony in his eyes. Patience, my dear Bunter. The players are assembling. Soon the curtain will rise on the truth. The lingering chill in the vicarage library seemed to press inward as Whimsy and Bunter sifted through the pages of Mr. Cornwood's diary, the words etched with a mounting dread that resonated with the unease settling in their own minds. The scholarly man's fear was palpable, an ominous shadow cast by secrets long buried, clawing to the surface after decades of silence. "Look here, Bunter," Whimsy said softly, pointing to a later entry dated just 3 days before the murder. "They grow impatient. The watchers in the village speak in whispers now, and I hear footsteps behind me even in the daylight. The old tale of William Hargrave is not yet finished, it seems. I must proceed with caution." His finger traced the words with deliberate care. It confirms that Cornwood felt threatened. But more importantly, it suggests he uncovered something that disturbed others enough to watch him closely. Bunter rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The mention of watchers implies more than casual curiosity. Someone, perhaps many, were actively monitoring him. But who and why? Whimsy folded the diary with care. The key lies in the connection between Hargrave's shadow and those in the village with a vested interest in silence. We must return to Mr. Teversham's testimony and re-examine the role of the organist. His visit to the vicarage late on the evening of the murder remains curious. If Cornwood was indeed watched, could Teversham have been one of the watchers? Or worse? Yet his alibi appears solid, Bunter reminded him. His sister's household places him away from the scene during the crucial hours. Yes, but an alibi supported by family is often fragile. I propose we speak to the sister herself and her household again, more thoroughly, and perhaps a discreet inquiry into Teversham's recent activities is warranted. The two men prepared to leave the vicarage when the vicar himself appeared, his expression weighed with unease. "Lord Peter, you should know, this morning the police found evidence that deepens the mystery." A locket hidden beneath the rose bush near the garden path. Bunter stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "A personal item?" "Yes," the vicar replied. "It bears the initials W.H., and inside a faded photograph of a young woman." Whimsy's gaze fixed on the garden, the place where the torn Cicero page had been found. William Hargrave's initials, a locket belonging to him or someone connected to him. The vicar's hands trembled slightly. "I believe this belonged to his daughter, or granddaughter perhaps." The woman in the photograph resembles a family portrait held by an elderly villager nearby. A woman named Alice Hargrave, said to have disappeared alongside William so many years ago. Whimsy's mind raced. This links the past directly to the present. Cornwood's research, The threats, the watchfulness. It's a lineage of secrets and disappearance. "May I suggest, my lord," said Bunter, "that we pay a visit to this elderly villager? If she holds the family portrait, she might also hold the key to what truly happened to the Hargraves." The vicar agreed and accompanied them to the village elder's cottage, a weathered, timber-framed house edged by wild rose bushes and thick ivy. Mrs. Beatrice Caldwell was a diminutive woman with sharp eyes that belied her age and a voice that carried both warmth and caution. "Ah, you're looking for the Hargraves," she said before introductions could be made, leading them inside. "William was my cousin once removed." They vanished without a word, and the village chose to forget or pretend to. Wimsey folded his hands respectfully. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you know what happened to them?" Her gaze darkened. There was a scandal. A fight, they said, between William and some local men who wanted to keep certain truths buried. After that, the Hargraves were gone. Some say they fled. Others whisper darker ends. But no one dared ask questions. Not openly. Bunter glanced at the portrait on the mantelpiece. A faded oil painting of a young woman whose eyes held a mixture of defiance and sorrow. "Do you think these old wounds might be connected to Mr. Cornwood's death?" Wimsey asked gently. "I do," she said firmly. "The past doesn't rest easily when disturbed." And Mr. Cornwood stirred the embers when he came here. Wimsey's thoughts turned inward. The picture of Alice Hargrave, the torn Latin page exhorting duty, the secret meetings Cornwood noted. These were all strands of a fabric woven with care and malice. The puzzle's edge was becoming sharper, the outlines more distinct. Back at the vicarage, Wimsey requested a meeting with Miss Eleanor Marsh. Her keen intellect and access to Cornwood's research made her indispensable, and she arrived promptly, a folder of papers clutched in her hand. "Lord Peter," she greeted him crisply, "I've been going through Felix's notes, and I found correspondence that might shed light on his last days, letters from someone signing only as C. They warn him to stop digging or face consequences." Wimsey's interest piqued. "A mysterious correspondent threatening Mr. Cornwood?" "Yes, but more intriguingly, these letters mention the name Hargrave and speak of the truth best left buried." She handed the letters over, and Wimsey read them carefully, noting the careful script and veiled menace. "Miss Marsh, do you suspect this C is someone local?" "It's possible. The tone suggests familiarity with the village, its history, and its players. Someone who knew Felix personally enough to provoke fear." Wimsey nodded slowly. "And the timing?" "Letters dated within the past fortnight. The final one arrived the day before Felix's death." "Thank you, Miss Marsh. This gives us new direction." Turning to Bunter, Wimsey mused. The pieces continue to fit. A man hunted by shadows from the past, an ancient grievance, warnings ignored, and a killer desperate enough to silence a scholar. Their next step was clear. They needed to confront Mr. Teversham again, but this time with the weight of new evidence. Teversham's home was quiet when they arrived that evening. The organist greeted them with a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Teversham," Wimsey began, "it appears Mr. Cornwood was the recipient of threatening letters signed C. We wonder if you might shed light on this mysterious correspondent." Teversham's face paled slightly. "I knew Felix was troubled, but I never saw those letters. I swear it. Would you be surprised to learn that your late-night visit to the vicarage coincided closely with one such letter's delivery?" Teversham hesitated, then said quietly, "I only went to discuss the harvest anthem, as I told you. But yes, I saw a letter left on the desk. I didn't read it. Why didn't you mention this before?" "I was afraid. The whole village seems to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible. I didn't want to become involved." Wimsey studied him carefully. "Fear is understandable, Mr. Teversham. But silence can be deadly. The organist looked away, a tremor betraying him. I admit, I feared for my position if secrets surfaced. But I never harmed Felix Bunter exchanged a glance with whimsy. Perhaps, but someone else with knowledge of these threats acted differently. Whimsy gave a faint smile. Exactly, Bunter. And as the night deepens, so too does the shadow cast by these secrets. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves and the village of Copplesby seemed to hold its breath once more, caught in the web of history, fear, and a desperate need for truth. And somewhere in that web, the murderer still moved, hiding behind the veneer of civility and waiting for the final act to unfold. The following morning dawned with an uncharacteristic crispness, the sort of brittle clarity that sharpens perception and lends an almost surgical precision to observation. Lord Peter Wimsey found himself once again pacing the venerable boards of the vicarage corridor, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he considered the theatrics that might soon unfold. The events of the previous day had distilled the mystery into something more tangible, a living enigma waiting for the final curtain to be drawn. Bunter was waiting in the library, a careful steward of order amid the growing chaos, his well-thumbed notebook open before him. "Sir," he began, "I have collated the testimonies and timelines." The pattern is peculiar, to say the least. The village's collective reticence is hardly surprising, but the intersection of threats, secrets, and the deceased's research suggests a motive steeped not merely in past grievances, but in present fear. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, Bunter. The shadows cast by old sins often stretch long, but it is the present unease that drives men to desperate acts. We must now examine the practicalities of that night. Specifically, the exact sequence surrounding Mr. Cornwood's demise. They turned to the earliest witnesses, Miss Eleanor Marsh and Mrs. Digby. The young woman's recollection was precise, if terse. I left the vicarage just after 8, my lord. Felix was in good spirits, despite the impending storm. I recall the clock in the hall striking the hour as I passed through. Nothing seemed amiss. Mrs. Digby, meanwhile, offered a more guarded account. "I served Mr. Cornwood his tea around 7:30. He was anxious, yes, but insisted on checking the guest-room door twice before retiring to his study. After 9, I heard no more sounds, only the sudden crash that startled me awake." Whimsy's mind raced, fitting the puzzle pieces together. The window left ajar in the guest-room, the disturbed gravel outside, the misplaced trousers under the floorboards, the hidden locket, all bore the fingerprints of a visitor moving with purpose and secrecy. "Bunter," Whimsy said quietly, "the discarded trousers suggest haste. The killer fled in haste, yes, but also left behind a vital clue. It is no coincidence the trousers bear a faint scent, perhaps lavender from the guest room itself, but mingled with something else. I intend to send them for analysis." Bunter inclined his head. "Very prudent, my lord." Turning his attention back to the village, Whimsy requested a discreet inquiry into recent visitors, a task Bunter undertook with his usual meticulousness. That afternoon, Bunter returned with news of a local innkeeper's observation. A stranger had been lodging in Copplesby under a pseudonym, arriving shortly before Cornwood's final days and departing just after the murder. A transient figure, Bunter explained, no known ties, but a presence nonetheless. Whimsy mused aloud, transient yet timely. The perfect suspect to deflect suspicion. Yet a man without connections cannot easily orchestrate the complex knowledge required to threaten Cornwood so precisely. He laid out a plan to speak with the innkeeper personally. The man was a portly, ruddy-faced fellow, quick with a smile but reticent when pressed on specifics. "Stranger?" Aye, there was one. Went by Mr. Clark or Clark, I forget which. Kept to himself mostly, but asked odd questions about village history and the Hargrave family. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. Did this Mr. Clark mention Cornwood's research or express particular interest in the vicarage? The innkeeper shrugged. Not directly. But he did linger near the vicarage grounds more than once, late at night, and once I saw him speaking with Teversham. Teversham again, Whimsy repeated, the pieces clicking together with increased urgency. A meeting in the shadows. Potential collusion. That evening, Whimsy and Bunter returned to the vicarage, determined to confront the organist one final time. The dusk had thickened to a somber violet, and the village settled into a quietude that felt both protective and conspiratorial. Teversham received them with a forced civility, his hands nervously clutching the edge of a polished music stand. "Mr. Teversham," Whimsy began, "I understand you have recently been in the company of a Mr. Clark, a man who appears to have taken an unusual interest in our tragic affair." Teversham's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes. Clark approached me, asking about the Hargrave legend. I warned him to stay clear. These matters are best left untouched. Yet the man's questions persisted, and you met him near the vicarage grounds on more than one occasion. Do you deny any involvement in the threats made to Mr. Cornwood?" "I deny everything," Teversham said, voice steady but eyes darting. "I am no conspirator." "Yet you admit fear," Whimsy pressed, "fear which might cloud judgment and invite dangerous choices." Teversham sighed heavily. "Fear of the village's dark past, of reputations ruined, but I swear on my music and my soul, I had no hand in Felix's death." Whimsy regarded him with an inscrutable smile. "Fear can drive men to silence or violence, but it also offers clues if one listens carefully." They left Teversham's home as the village bells tolled the hour, their resonance echoing faintly in the distance, a sound both solemn and foreboding. Returning to the vicarage, Whimsy turned his attention to the peculiar detail of the misaligned clocks noted earlier. He spent several minutes examining the grandfather clock in the hall and the mantel clocks in the drawing-room, each set just a few minutes apart, but never quite in sync. "Time, Bunter, is a slippery mistress," Whimsy mused. "Small discrepancies can mask the most deliberate deception." Bunter nodded, watching as Whimsy retrieved his notebook and began to map out a precise timeline, aligning the clock's chimes with the testimonies and the inferred movements of the suspects. "Observe," Whimsy said, tapping the paper. "Teversham claims to have left the vicarage shortly after 8, but if the grandfather clock struck 8 at precisely 8:03 and the mantel clock at 8:07, his alibi frays at the edges." Bunter frowned. "So the clock's misalignment may have been exploited?" "Precisely. A deliberate obscuring of time intended to create confusion, and if so, the killer must be intimately familiar with the house and its mechanics." That notion steered Whimsy's thoughts back to the vicarage staff. The servants, the housekeeper, anyone who might move unseen in the shadows. He requested a private word with Mrs. Digby once more. "Madam," Whimsy said softly, "might you recall any unusual behavior amongst the staff in the past weeks? Any odd hours, nervous glances, or whispered conversations?" Mrs. Digby hesitated, then admitted, "There has been some tension, my lord. Mr. Grayson, the gardener, has been strangely secretive. He has been seen near the guest room at odd times, and I overheard him speaking urgently with Teversham." "Mr. Grayson," Whimsy echoed, intrigued. "A gardener with secrets." "Yes, sir. He has been with the vicarage for many years, but lately he's been withdrawn." This revelation opened a new avenue of inquiry. Whimsy and Bunter sought out Mr. Grayson the following afternoon in the sprawling gardens that bordered the vicarage. The man was tall, lean, with weathered features and wary eyes. "Mr. Grayson," Whimsy began, "we understand you have had some discussions with Mr. Teversham concerning Mr. Cornwood's research." Grayson's gaze hardened. "I have. I warned Teversham to leave it be. There are things best left alone." "Indeed. But what did you know of Mr. Clark, the stranger in the village?" Grayson's jaw clenched. I don't know who you mean." Whimsy's smile was faint but firm. "The man who arrived shortly before Mr. Cornwood's death, who spoke to you in Teversham under the cloak of night." Grayson shifted uneasily. "That man. He brought trouble. I tried to keep him away from the vicarage." "Why?" "Because he was not what he seemed. He spoke of debts owed, debts from long ago. The Hargrave name carries weight, and that weight threatens to crush us all." The gardener's confession revealed the deep roots of fear and silence that tangled the village, binding even those who wished to speak. As evening fell, Whimsy and Bunter retreated to the vicarage study, the threads of the case weaving closer around their quarry. The guest room's tidiness, the misplaced items, the hidden locket, the misaligned clocks, all pointed to a killer intimately acquainted with both the history and the mechanics of the vicarage. Yet the most damning evidence lay in the psychological landscape: fear of exposure, desperate loyalty, and the unrelenting grip of the past. Whimsy lit his pipe, the smoke curling like the spirals of a thought in his mind. "The stage is set, Bunter. Soon the final act will begin, and the true nature of this tragedy shall be revealed, not by the flicker of superstition, but by the unerring light of reason." Bunter nodded solemnly, the quiet anticipation between them a testament to the intricate dance of deduction that had brought them to this precipice. Outside, the village of Copplesby settled into darkness, its secrets coiled tightly, waiting for the moment when the truth would shatter the stillness forever. The following morning found Lord Peter Whimsy reclining in a high-backed chair by the vicarage window, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he surveyed the garden bathed in the soft, diffused light of early June. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the distant, briny tang of the sea, a reminder of Copplesby's persistent proximity to both nature's gentleness and its caprice. Yet the serenity was deceiving. Beneath the placid surface, the murmurings of suspicion and fear gathered like an impending storm. Bunter was seated across from him, meticulously reviewing his notes, the faint rustle of paper punctuating the contemplative silence. "My lord," Bunter began, "there remains the matter of the guest room's immaculate order. It troubles me that none of the household could account for anyone entering or leaving it in the hours before the murder, yet the room's tidiness suggests recent occupation or deliberate staging." Whimsy gave a dry chuckle. "Ah, Bunter, the devil is always in the details that seem trivial. A guest room too tidy, like a theater set left untouched after a rehearsal, speaks volumes. It is precisely because it appears so innocuous that we must probe deeper. The question that gnawed most insistently was why Felix Cornwood had been so intent on concealing something within that room. The discovery of the locket beneath the floorboards, coupled with the curious state of the window left ajar, pointed to a secret well guarded, yet perilously close to exposure. Whimsy rose abruptly, moving toward the door with the fluid grace of a man who had just stumbled upon a revelation. "Bunter, fetch me the household inventory and cross-reference the recent purchases. I have a mind to examine the threads of material evidence more closely." In the servants' quarters, the inventory was a modest ledger, listing consumables, linens, and the occasional trifle. Yet, nestled between the usual entries was an unusual notation, a set of curtains recently acquired for the guest room, described as heavy damask, deep crimson. Whimsy's eyes sparkled. Curious. The guest room's curtains were replaced just last month, yet no mention was made of this to the rest of the household. A secret purchase, perhaps? Bunter nodded. Such an item would require precise fitting, unlikely to be unnoticed. Their next course was clear. If the curtains had been installed recently, who had arranged for their delivery and installation? And more pressingly, why? The answer could not be left to conjecture. An interview with Mrs. Digby, the housekeeper, yielded no immediate enlightenment. The curtains arrived in a plain package. "No name attached," she said with a hint of reticence. "I assumed it was a gift from Mr. Cornwood." though he gave no instructions. Whimsy's thoughts turned inward. The curtain's deep crimson hue was no mere aesthetic choice. It was a deliberate symbol, a shade evocative of passion, danger, and secrecy. Turning to the physicality of the guest room once more, Whimsy examined the window frame with renewed scrutiny. The latch was peculiar, an old-fashioned catch that required considerable effort to unlatch from the outside, but could be easily left unsecured from within. Had the killer exploited this feature to gain entry or exit unnoticed? Bunter, Whimsy mused. The open window, the misplaced trousers, the scent of lavender mixed with something muskier. Our killer was not merely familiar with this room, but with its vulnerabilities. Later that afternoon, they returned to the village to speak once more with Teversham. The organist appeared more composed, yet the strain beneath his composed exterior was palpable. "I've reflected on our conversation, Mr. Whimsy," he began. "I must confess there are matters I withheld out of fear of scandal and the ruin of reputations." Whimsy inclined his head, encouraging him to continue. Felix was not merely studying the Hargrave family history, Teversham admitted. He was investigating an old scandal, one that implicated certain living members of the community. He sought to unearth truths better left buried. "And did you warn him against this?" "I did, but he was determined. He believed that the past held keys to understanding the present turmoil. Whimsy's mind pieced together the ramifications. The victim's research was not academic curiosity, but a probing into the village's dark underbelly, threatening the fragile equilibrium maintained by silence and complicity. A knock interrupted the confession. It was Bunter, bearing a small parcel. "My lord, the analysis of the trousers has returned. The chemical residue suggests the presence of a rare scent compound, one used in a perfume popular among a certain social circle, but not available locally." Whimsy's smile was sardonic. "Ah, a clue dressed as a scent. How very theatrical." This perfume, he surmised, must connect the killer not only to the vicarage, but to the wider social sphere, the precise circle to which Cornwood's enemies belonged. Returning to the vicarage, Whimsy focused on the psychological nuances at play. The evidence so far pointed to a murderer who was neither brutish nor reckless, but calculating and intimately familiar with the web of relationships ensnaring the victim. He revisited his notes on Mr. Grayson, the gardener, whose evasive behavior now seemed more ominous. Could a man accustomed to tending the earth also nurture secrets deadly enough to kill for? Whimsy called upon Grayson once more, this time with a sharper line of questioning. "Mr. Grayson, tell me truly, did you ever witness Felix Cornwood in conflict with any member of the village?" Grayson's eyes flickered with unease. "He argued with Teversham once, over some parish matter. But that was public, no cause for murder." "Any other disputes?" "None that I know of." "But you warned Teversham about the stranger, Clark?" "Yes, because that man stirred old ghosts." Whimsy leaned forward, voice low but incisive. "Old ghosts which some would kill to keep silent?" Grayson nodded grimly. "Aye, secrets buried deep, but I swear I did not kill Felix." The gardener's testimony, though earnest, felt like the edge of a deeper truth. Whimsy knew that the key lay not in what was said, but what was left unsaid. The subtle shifts in tone, the flicker of hesitation. Back in the study, Whimsy sat before the array of timelines and evidence, the fragmented pieces slowly converging into a coherent whole. He lit his pipe thoughtfully. "Bunter, we are now confronted with a question of motive entwined with opportunity, knowledge, and fear. The killer was someone who could manipulate time's perception, navigate the vicarage unseen, and understood the power of secrets." "Could it be someone within the household?" Bunter ventured. "Or someone close to it," Whimsy agreed. "We must consider the possibility that the murderer sought not only to silence Felix, but to preserve a facade. a social equilibrium precariously balanced upon ignorance. The hours waned, and with nightfall came a peculiar quiet. Whimsy's eyes drifted toward the guest-room door, still closed, its mysteries as tightly shuttered as the crimson curtains newly installed within. The ticking of the clocks marked time's relentless passage, each second bringing them closer to a revelation that would shatter the fragile veneer of Copplesby's civility. And beneath the polished surfaces and polite smiles, the shadows grew longer, waiting for the final act in this Gothic drama to unfold. The following morning, the vicarage was shrouded in a thin mist that seemed to blur the edges of reality itself, lending the familiar garden an otherworldly aspect. Lord Peter Wimsey, undeterred by the atmospheric murk, entered the guest-room once again, this time with a deliberate purpose that set his usually languid gait to a more purposeful stride. Bunter followed closely behind, bearing a small but heavy parcel from the village chemist, the contents of which might yet untangle the knot of contradictions that bound the case. The guest room, with its immaculate crimson curtains drawn back to admit the pale daylight, was as tidy as ever. Too tidy, Wimsey thought with a faintly amused air. The bedspread was perfectly smooth, the furniture aligned with geometric precision, as if the room had been prepared not for living, but for observation. Yet it was here, amidst this sterile perfection, that the crime's grim heart pulsed unseen. Wimsey began his examination with the window, that stubborn anomaly that had first drawn his suspicion. The latch mechanism, a quaint relic from a bygone era, was still unlatched, allowing a slight draught to disturb the heavy curtains. He ran a gloved finger along the sill, noting the faintest dust patterns and the telltale smudges of recent contact. It was, he mused, a carefully contrived invitation for misdirection. Turning his attention to the parcel Bunter had delivered, Wimsey carefully opened the box. Within lay a small bottle of clear liquid, an extraction from the perfume residue found on the trousers, and a swatch of fabric matching the crimson curtains. The chemist's report indicated the liquid contained a rare compound used exclusively in a particular brand of luxury cologne, known to be favored by a select echelon of society, including one Mrs. Lydia Hargrave. Wimsey's eyebrows arched in quiet triumph. Our killer is as particular in scent as in strategy. Bunter, ever pragmatic, inquired, "Might we confront Mrs. Hargrave with this evidence?" "Not yet," Wimsey replied, pacing the room. "Confrontation before preparation is the mark of the amateur. We must first understand the chronology, how and when this scent could have found its way into the guest room and upon those incriminating trousers." Wimsey's thoughts drifted to the timeline, that delicate lattice upon which truth balanced precariously. The murder had occurred sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight, during which several parties claimed to be elsewhere, alibis that seemed superficially sound, yet frayed upon closer inspection. He summoned the housekeeper, Mrs. Digby, once more, this time with a specific query. "Madame, when was the last time the guest room was entered prior to the discovery of the body?" Mrs. Digby's expression was guarded. "Only by Mr. Cornwood himself, sir, and the maid who prepared it. No one else had reason to enter, and the maid, what is her name?" "Emily, sir." A steady girl, though a little shy, Wimsey made a mental note to speak with Emily immediately. The reticence of servants often concealed crucial truths, masked beneath deference and fear. Later that afternoon, Emily was brought to the vicarage study, cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but eyes sharp beneath their downcast lids. "Emily, might you recall if anything unusual occurred in the house the night Mr. Cornwood died?" Wimsey's tone was gentle, yet probing. Emily hesitated. I thought I heard voices near the guest room, sir." "But I dared not listen. Voices? How many?" "Two, I believe. One sounded angry, the other calmer. They spoke in hushed tones. Wimsey's interest piqued. "Did you recognize either voice?" "No, sir." "I'm sorry," Bunter interjected. "Did you hear footsteps afterwards? Anyone leaving the room?" Emily nodded faintly. "Yes, a man's footsteps, slow and deliberate, heading down the corridor." This testimony, though partial, provided a vital link. Wimsey quickly deduced that the killer was someone who moved with calculated care, ensuring no undue attention was drawn. Meanwhile, news from the village had reached the vicar. Several residents expressed unease about the sudden upheaval, whispering about the old curse that seemed to hang over Copplesby like a pall. While Wimsey regarded such superstitions with amused skepticism, he recognized their utility as social pressure points, often exploited by those wishing to cloak their machinations in shadow. A visit to the local postmaster yielded another intriguing discovery. Felix Cornwood had received a letter only days before his death, unsigned and delivered without ceremony, containing cryptic reference to settling accounts and secrets best left to silence. Wimsey's keen mind pieced the fragments together. The letter's tone suggested a blackmailer or someone keen to intimidate. Back at the vicarage, Wimsey laid the evidence before the assembled household. The letter, the crimson curtains, the scent of the exclusive cologne, and Emily's testimony. Eyes flickered with discomfort, some more than others. Mrs. Lydia Hargrave, a striking woman with a gaze sharp enough to cut glass, met Wimsey's quiet scrutiny with practiced calm. "My lord," she said smoothly, "you imply that I might be implicated by the scent of a perfume I occasionally wear. Surely this is circumstantial at best." "On its own, yes," Wimsey conceded, "but combined with other elements, it suggests proximity, opportunity, and motive." He paused to let the weight of his words settle before continuing. Felix Cornwood was uncovering truths dangerous to those who cherished silence. His research threatened reputations and perhaps fortunes. A murmur rippled through the room. Wimsey then addressed Mr. Grayson, the gardener, who had remained silent. "Mr. Grayson, you warned of old ghosts. Might you speak more plainly now? What secrets does this village hide that would drive a man to murder?" Grayson's jaw tightened. "There are debts, grudges, and betrayals that run deeper than the soil." Felix unearthed some would kill to protect. Wimsey nodded. And yet, if the killer sought to maintain a facade, why such theatrical staging? The open window, the misplaced trousers, the too tidy guest room. Perhaps, Bunter offered, to mislead and confound, like the red herrings in a play. "Exactly," Wimsey said, eyes alight. The killer believed himself the director of a tragedy, but missed the finer points of the script. As evening descended, Wimsey returned to the guest room alone, seeking to reconstruct the final moments of the night. He examined the carpet's pattern, noting a slight indentation where a heavy object had once rested. Nearby, a faint discoloration hinted at a spill, quickly wiped but not entirely erased. A sudden realization struck him. The guest room was more than a chamber of rest. It was a stage upon which the victim's final scene had played out, one carefully choreographed, yet vulnerable to the smallest slip. Lighting a candle, Wimsey inspected the floorboards near the locket's hiding place. The wood bore a subtle scratch, fresh and inconsistent with age. He pressed his ear to the boards, detecting a faint hollow resonance. The locket, then, had been deliberately concealed beneath a removable panel, a secret compartment known only to a select few. "Bunter," Wimsey whispered into the quiet. "The victim's secrets lie just beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively." As he extinguished the candle, the room seemed to hold its breath, the crimson curtains swaying gently in the night breeze, guarding the final clues until their unveiling. The game was nearing its climax, and Wimsey, ever the patient hunter, was poised to draw the net ever tighter around the elusive killer who believed themselves master of the house and its hidden terrors. Lord Peter Wimsey's thoughts had been turning over the puzzle since that final inspection of the guest room, the faint hollow under the floorboards particularly troubling him. It was a classic hiding place, one that bespoke both premeditation and a profound mistrust of even the closest confidants. The knowledge that Felix Cornwood had taken pains to conceal something of great importance made the tangled web of motives all the more urgent to unravel. With dawn still faint on the horizon, Whimsy requested Bunter accompany him back to the vicarage, the both of them arriving just as the household was stirring. The housekeeper, Mrs. Digby, was called upon once more to unlock the guest room and fetch the necessary implements. Within minutes, a small panel in the floor, barely distinguishable to any but the most observant, was carefully pried open. Beneath it lay a small leather pouch, worn but securely fastened. Whimsy's fingers, deft and assured, loosened the pouch's tie. Inside were several yellow documents, brittle with age, and a small folded piece of paper. The documents, upon quick inspection, appeared to be correspondences. Letters between Felix Cornwood and an unknown correspondent, written in a formal script and peppered with references to exposures, debts, and the need for discretion. The folded paper was a letter, more recent, whose contents chilled Whimsy even as he read them. "Your curiosity endangers us all. Cease your inquiries, or face consequences beyond mere whispers." The tone was unmistakably threatening, yet the signature was missing. Here was a clear motive for silencing Felix, but it remained to be seen who among those present harbored both the means and the will. As Whimsy and Bunter emerged from the guest room, they were met by the tense faces of the household. Lydia Hargrave, looking more composed than she felt, demanded, "And what have you discovered, my lord? Is the matter truly as grave as you suggest?" Whimsy inclined his head with quiet gravity. "Indeed, Mrs. Hargrave, we find ourselves in possession of threats that are no idle boast. The victim was embroiled in matters not wholly of this world, matters that I suspect someone here wished to keep buried." The household exchanged glances, none more guarded than Mr. Grayson's. Whimsy continued, "It is clear that the murder was not a crime of passion, nor of mere chance. It was an act of calculated desperation designed to prevent truth from surfacing." The day wore on with a series of interviews and re-examinations. Emily, the maid, was recalled for a more detailed account of the voices she heard. Her earlier uncertainty had crystallized into a firm conviction that one speaker was indeed Mr. Grayson. This revelation cast the gardener in a new light, prompting a discreet inquiry into his recent activities. It emerged that Grayson had been seen in the village post office on the day the threatening letter was posted, a fact he initially failed to disclose. When confronted, Grayson faltered, his usual reticence giving way to a brittle defensiveness. "I had my reasons," he said darkly, "but murder was never among them." The puzzle deepened with a visit to the village church, where Whimsy examined the clock mechanism with a particular interest. The bell had tolled an irregular sequence the night of the murder, 3 times in quick succession, then a pause, then 4 more tolls. The sexton confirmed the clock had recently been serviced, and that the chimes were sometimes slightly off rhythm. This seemingly trivial detail struck Whimsy as a possible signal, a means of covert communication masked by routine. Back at the vicarage, Whimsy laid out his deductions to Bunter in the dim light of the study. The bell's pattern suggests someone was sending a message to an accomplice, someone familiar with the code. "And the clock's irregularities?" Bunter asked, a necessary element to disguise the message. Who would benefit from such clandestine signaling? Their thoughts turned again to Lydia Hargrave, whose frequent absences had previously seemed mere affectation. Upon further questioning, it was revealed that she often met clandestinely with a man in the village, a man unknown to the rest of the household. Whimsy dispatched Bunter to ascertain the identity of this mysterious visitor, while he himself focused on reassembling the timelines with exactitude. Every minute accounted for, every footstep measured. The breakthrough came when Bunter returned with news. The visitor was none other than Dr. Alistair Crane, a disgraced physician recently expelled from London medical circles under a cloud of scandal. Crane's reputation for obfuscation was well known, and his presence in Copplesby, coinciding with Lydia's secret meetings, raised more questions than answers. Wimsey decided it was time for a more direct approach. He invited Lydia to the vicarage drawing-room under the pretense of needing clarification on some household details. Her composure, while admirable, was thinly veiled. "Lord Peter, I fail to see the relevance of my personal acquaintances to this tragic matter." Wimsey smiled thinly. "Madame, in a puzzle such as this, no detail is irrelevant. Even the most delicate threads may unravel the whole." He produced the letter threatening Felix Cornwood and watched as a flicker of colour drained from her cheeks. "Dr. Crane and you have been in correspondence, have you not? And I take it the contents of those exchanges pertain to Mr. Cornwood's investigations?" Lydia's eyes narrowed. "You presume much, my lord, yet the facts are persistent. Felix's inquiries threaten to expose certain secrets perhaps involving your visitor." Lydia's defiance cracked, if only slightly. "Dr. Crane is a man of complicated past, but I deny any knowledge of threats or motives for murder." Wimsey regarded her with the patience of a cat stalking its prey. "And yet, I'm told you were present in the village late the night of the murder, contrary to your stated whereabouts." A long silence ensued before Lydia spoke again, voice low. "Very well. I was there, but not to harm Felix. I sought only to retrieve letters that might ruin us all if made public." "Then you admit the correspondence was perilous enough to warrant such risk?" "Yes," she said, eyes fixed firmly ahead. This admission shifted the investigation's focus from the victim to those around him. The question remained, who among these tangled relationships had the most to gain from his silence? Later that evening, Wimsey arranged a meeting with Dr. Crane at the vicarage, a calculated move to unsettle the physician's facade. Crane arrived with an air of practiced indifference, but Wimsey detected the subtle tremor of unease beneath the surface. "Dr. Crane," Wimsey began, "your presence in Copplesby and your connection to Mrs. Hargrave are, shall we say, fortuitously timed." Crane's gaze was guarded. "I'm a man seeking refuge, Lord Peter. Nothing more, but refuge from what? Your recent disgrace, or from deeper entanglements?" Crane's composure faltered. "I admit to errors in my past, but murder is not among them." "Yet you were seen near the vicarage on the night of the murder," Wimsey pressed. "Do you care to explain?" Crane swallowed visibly. "I was meeting Lydia. We were planning to recover letters that could devastate us both." Wimsey inclined his head thoughtfully. "So a joint effort to suppress dangerous secrets. Yet suppressing secrets rarely follows a peaceful course." Crane's eyes flickered with something between fear and defiance. "You will find no more from me tonight." Wimsey allowed the threat to hang in the air, knowing that the true unraveling had only just begun. As Crane departed into the darkening night, Wimsey turned to Bunter with a wry smile. "Our players have revealed their hands, yet the game is far from over." The guest room, with its perfect order and hidden compartments, waited silently to disclose its final truths. And Wimsey, with his usual blend of patience and inexorable logic, was prepared to force the unveiling. The shadow of secrets loomed large, but in the end, it was the light of reason that would illuminate the darkest corners of Copplesby. The house at Copplesby was quieter now, though tension clung to its walls like a stubborn fog. Lord Peter Wimsey had retired early to the vicarage study, a modest room lined with worn volumes and faintly smelling of dust and tobacco smoke. The events of the past days had unfolded with an elegance of logic so precise it was almost cruel, each revelation laying bare a fresh wound beneath the polished veneer of civility. Bunter sat opposite him, the ever-reliable steward's face composed but alert, knowing full well that the final act was yet to be played. Whimsy's gaze rested on the scattered papers before him, letters, notes, and his own hastily scrawled annotations. The incriminating correspondence between Felix Cornwood, Lydia Hargrave, and Dr. Alistair Crane suggested a desperate triangle bound by secrets and shame. Yet none of them had the air of a cold-blooded killer. If Lydia and Crane conspired to suppress Felix's investigations, surely that alone did not lead to murder. No, Whimsy thought. The answer must lie deeper, in the psychological shadow play that often motivates the most chilling crimes. He rose and paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back as his mind traced the timeline once more. Felix's arrival at the vicarage, his secret meetings, the bell's irregular tolls, the mysterious figure glimpsed near the house, the threatening letters, the hidden compartment, and finally, the murder itself, executed with a careful hand and a killer's calculated patience. His eyes fell to the guest room, that immaculate cell of silence and secrets. Something about it still unsettled him. The room was too tidy, too controlled, not simply because of the lack of disorder, but because it suggested the victim himself had been trying to maintain an illusion of normality amidst chaos. What had Felix been hiding? And from whom? The clock chimed the half-hour, with a solemnity that echoed through the empty halls. A knock at the door heralded Bunter's return, bearing a note he had just received from the constable. "Your lordship, the officer wishes to report a development from the village." Whimsy took the note and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was terse, almost mechanical. A local woman, Mrs. Agnes Clay, has come forward. She claims to have witnessed a heated argument on the night of the murder between Felix Cornwood and a stranger. The stranger is described as tall, with dark hair and a distinctive limp. Whimsy's eyes narrowed. A limp? That is a detail worthy of note. Bunter nodded. "I understand the constable intends to bring Mrs. Clay to the vicarage shortly for an interview." "Excellent. Let us prepare accordingly." When Mrs. Clay arrived, she was a small, sharp-featured woman, her manner brisk but nervous. She spoke quickly, her gaze flickering as if afraid of unseen eyes. "I was walking near the vicarage just after 9, my lord," she began, "and I heard voices raised in anger. Mr. Cornwood was arguing with a man I didn't recognize. A stranger. He had a limp, and he was furious about something Felix had discovered." "Did you hear the nature of the dispute?" Whimsy inquired gently. "No, sir." "Only that the man was threatening Felix, saying he'd pay dearly if those secrets got out." "And this stranger, did he come into the house?" "No, sir. He left in a hurry down the lane, limping badly. I saw him clutch his side like he'd been hurt." Whimsy filed the information carefully. A limp, a threat, and a hurried departure all suggested a connection to the crime. Perhaps the stranger was the murderer, or at least a pivotal player. The puzzle was growing more intricate. Whimsy mused aloud, "Bunter, what do we know of the resident's ailments or injuries?" "Anyone with a limp or an old wound." Bunter thought for a moment. "Not among the household, my lord." But the local physician, Dr. Crane, was known to have sustained a leg injury in his youth, according to some village gossip. Whimsy's lips curled in a faint smile. Curious indeed. The physician, with a questionable past, secret meetings with Lydia Hargrave, and now a possible limp. He rose and donned his coat. "We shall pay Dr. Crane a visit. It seems he has more to answer for than mere scandal," the walk to Doctor. Crane's modest lodgings was brisk, the early evening air crisp with the scent of the sea. Upon arrival, the door was opened by the physician himself, his face pale and guarded. "Lord Peter," Crane greeted with forced civility, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Whimsy stepped inside, eyes sharp. "Dr. Crane, it appears your limp and your whereabouts on the night in question are matters of considerable interest. Care to explain?" Crane's expression flickered, but he maintained his composure. My leg does indeed bear a slight imperfection. As for my movements, I have told you everything. And yet Mrs. Clay's testimony places a limping stranger arguing violently with Felix Cornwood near the vicarage shortly before the murder. Would you care to account for your whereabouts precisely at that time? Crane's hands clenched. I was elsewhere, tending to a patient. Wimsey was unconvinced. A convenient alibi, if somewhat vague. Might I see this patient? Crane hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Very well. I shall take you to him. What followed was a tense journey to a humble cottage on the edge of the village. Inside, an elderly woman sat in a chair, pale and frail, but alert. This is Mrs. Elsie Harper, Crane explained. She required urgent care that evening. Wimsey examined the woman with clinical detachment. May I ask, Mrs. Harper, if Dr. Crane was indeed with you around 9 o'clock that night? She nodded weakly. He was here, tending to my fever. Wimsey turned back to Crane. And yet Mrs. Clay places you near the vicarage shortly before. An unfortunate contradiction. Crane's composure broke. I left Mrs. Harper for a short while. I did not wish to alarm her by leaving altogether. Wimsey smiled thinly. And during that absence? Crane looked away, defeated. I was near the vicarage, yes. But I did not kill Felix Cornwood. Perhaps you came to warn him? Wimsey suggested. Crane shook his head. No, I came to confront him. I feared his investigations would drag me into the open. The air thickened with implication. Yet someone else was involved. The man with the limp was not alone, was he? Crane's silence answered the question. Back at the vicarage, Wimsey reviewed the day's revelations. The threads of the narrative had pulled taut, the noose of truth tightening. There remained, however, a final piece missing, the killer's true identity and motive. The key lay, as ever, in the minor details, the misaligned clock, the secret compartments, the carefully staged guest room. Wimsey took a breath and turned to Bunter. Prepare the drawing room. We must recreate the events of that night. The devil is always in the detail, and I intend to expose him. That night, with the household assembled under a veneer of polite curiosity, Lord Peter Wimsey orchestrated a reenactment of the crucial moments. The tolling of the bell, the arrival and departure of visitors, the timing of footsteps on the gravel, and the sequence of conversations overheard or glimpsed. His voice was calm, almost theatrical, yet every word bore the weight of steel. As you observe, the clock's chimes were deliberately altered to send a covert signal, he explained. Only one person had the knowledge and access to manipulate the mechanism, Mr. Grayson, the gardener. A murmur rippled through the assembly. But that alone does not make him the murderer. Wimsey continued. He was used, manipulated by another who feared exposure more than any man's suspicion. His gaze settled on Lydia Hargrave. Mrs. Hargrave's secret meetings, her desperation to recover incriminating letters, suggest a woman desperate to protect her reputation. Yet it was her brother, Felix, who stood in the way. The room held its breath. And Dr. Crane, Wimsey said quietly, a man with a limp, a dubious past, and a motive to silence Felix for his own sake. Crane shifted uneasily. But the final truth lies here, Wimsey said, producing a small brass key found beneath the guest room floorboards. A key that fits the vicar's own cabinet, where those letters were hidden. He turned to the vicar, who nodded grimly. Felix Cornwood discovered the secret of a long-forgotten scandal, one that could destroy a family's name and livelihood. In a desperate act, a calculated killer sought to preserve that secret, killing Felix to ensure silence. His eyes swept the room once more. Yet the murder was not committed by the obvious suspects, but by the quietest presence among us. Mrs. Digby, the housekeeper, whose loyalty to the family was absolute and whose fear of disgrace led her to desperate measures. A gasp escaped from several lips. Mrs. Digby, pale as chalk, finally spoke in a trembling voice. I only wished to protect them, to save the family. Whimsy nodded, pity mingling with resolve. And so you staged the room, planted false trails, and counted on the shadows to conceal your deed. She collapsed into a chair, defeated. The household was left to grapple with the revelation, a reminder that beneath the surface of decorum and civility lay passions and fears as potent as any murder weapon. As the dawn light seeped through the curtains, Whimsy lit a cigarette and looked out across the village rooftops. Justice, he mused aloud to Bunter, is often not a matter of black and white, but the shades in between. And in these shades, the human heart reveals its most troubling secrets. Bunter nodded solemnly, and together they prepared to leave Copplesby behind. Another case closed, another mystery untangled by the inexorable logic and unerring wit of Lord Peter Wimsey. The early morning light filtered pale and fragile through the stained glass window of the vicarage study, casting fractured patterns on the polished wood. Lord Peter Wimsey sat behind the battered desk, his posture relaxed but eyes alert, those keen, calculating eyes that missed nothing. Around him, the assembled household awaited the moment of final reckoning, a mixture of apprehension, curiosity, and quiet dread thickening the air. Whimsy cleared his throat softly, a faint smile playing about his lips as he surveyed the faces. The vicar, his wife, Lydia Hargrave, Dr. Crane, Mrs. Digby, and even the dogged constable who had faithfully observed the proceedings. None spoke. All eyes were fixed, expectant. "It is often remarked," Whimsy began, "that the devil is in the details. In our little drama, it is equally true that the truth lurks in the minutiae of human frailty and the accidents of circumstance." He paused, letting the silence gather like a net. Felix Cornwood, though ostensibly a curious but harmless amateur, had stumbled upon a scandal that would have undone more than a reputation. It would have shattered the delicate social architecture that sustains families like the Hargraves. A subtle tightening of Lydia's lips, a flicker in Crane's gaze. Yet, knowing of this secret alone does not condemn. Nor does anger, however genuine, justify murder. The chain that binds guilt to consequence is longer and more twisted. Whimsy stood and began to walk slowly, hands clasped behind his back, his tone arch, but entirely serious. Mrs. Digby, our impeccable housekeeper, was the silent guardian of that fragile equilibrium. She alone possessed both the knowledge of the secret and the access to every room. But it was her fear of disgrace and the collapse of the family she served so devotedly, that drove her to a terrible resolution. Mrs. Digby's hands trembled slightly. "I never wished to harm Felix. I only wanted to protect." Whimsy nodded gently. "And so you staged the guest room, immaculate beyond reason, to disguise the violence that took place elsewhere. You manipulated the clocks, altered the bells' tolling, and created false trails for the unwary eye." He turned to the constable. "The limping stranger Mrs. Clay described was none other than Dr. Crane himself, forced into a brief confrontation with Felix as his own culpability threatened to unravel. Yet the fatal blow was struck by Mrs. Digby, whose knowledge of the house's secret passages allowed her to act unseen. The housekeeper's facade crumbled, the weight of years and guilt pressing down. Your meticulousness," Whimsy continued with a touch of dry irony, "was your undoing. The misaligned clock, the missing salver, the inexplicable absence of dust, all pieces of an elaborate puzzle that ultimately betrayed you." He folded his hands. "Justice, in this case, is tempered with understanding. Mrs. Digby's crime was one of desperation, a tragic error born of misplaced loyalty." The room remained silent, the truth settling like dust. "As for the rest," Whimsy said, lighting a cigar and exhaling a thin plume of smoke, "let us hope that Copplesby may now breathe freer, its shadows a little less dense." He turned to Lydia, his voice softer. "And you, Mrs. Hargrave, may find strength in truth rather than concealment. With a faint bow and a glance toward Bunter, who stood ready, Whimsy concluded, "I take my leave with a line from our dear Shakespeare. The truth will out. Always it does." The household watched as Lord Peter Wimsey stepped into the brightening day, leaving behind a house cleansed of secrets but marked forever by the subtle ironies of human nature.